He was a beloved husband, a proud father, and the heir to a quiet family legacy. But one morning, he took a sip from a cup that would end all. What followed wasn't just a tragedy. It was betrayal in its most perverse form from the one man he trusted most. The town of Westbridge was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, at least not on the surface. Families knew each other by name. Kids rode their bikes down tree-lined streets. People still left their doors unlocked. And at the center of it all was Daniel Whitmore, a 35-year-old man who, to the community, embodied everything good about small-town America. He ran his own successful carpentry business, Whitmore Woodworks, with the help of his father, Charles Whitmore, a retired Army veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor and a stern sense of morality. Daniel had recently expanded the shop, planning to leave it to his children one day. At home, Daniel was equally admired. His wife, Rebecca, was a high school literature teacher. They'd met at a book fair a decade earlier, and their marriage seemed forged in gold, filled with laughter, quiet date nights, and family road trips with their two young kids, Emma and Jake. But behind every picture-perfect family is a frame you never question until it cracks. Before we begin, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more intriguing stories. Now let's jump in. On a warm Thursday morning in early spring, Daniel complained of nausea after breakfast. Rebecca remembered it vividly. He'd made coffee for both of them. She took hers to the front porch. Daniel stayed behind, sipping his slowly. Minutes later, he was doubled over in the bathroom, sweating, trembling, vomiting. She called 911, thinking it might be food poisoning or maybe a stomach virus. But by the time the ambulance arrived, Daniel was barely conscious. At the hospital, doctors couldn't pinpoint what was wrong. His organs were failing rapidly, too rapidly. Within 12 hours, Daniel Whitmore was dead. The coroner listed the cause of death as multi-organ failure due to acute toxicity, but he couldn't identify the exact toxin. Not yet. Rebecca was devastated. The entire town mourned with her. But in the days that followed, as the funeral was planned and condolences poured in, one person stepped in as a steady presence. Charles Whitmore, Daniel's father. He handled everything. The funeral costs, the child care, even managing Daniel's business for the time being. Charles insisted he was just helping the family stay afloat. It's what Daniel would have wanted, he said. Rebecca leaned on him, unsure how to manage grief and logistics all at once. Charles had always been a bit rigid, a little controlling, but he was dependable. And right now, she needed that. Over the weeks that followed, Charles began spending more and more time at the house. He cooked dinner, picked up the kids, sat on the porch with Rebecca long into the night. At first, it felt comforting, but soon it started to feel off. Charles began making small comments about how lonely he was, how no one understood grief like they did, how they needed to stick together now. He touched her arm when they spoke, held her gaze a little too long. Then, just 1 month after Daniel's death, he said it. "You and I, we don't have to be alone." Rebecca froze. She wasn't even sure she'd heard him right. "We both lost Daniel," he continued. "But that doesn't mean the love has to die with him." She stared at him in disbelief. Was he drunk? Grieving? Delusional? "Charles, you're Daniel's father." But Charles wasn't ashamed. In fact, he doubled down. "Daniel would have wanted me to take care of you. Of the kids. We were already family. Why not make it official?" Rebecca shut it down immediately. Politely at first, then firmly. But he didn't take it well. Days later, the coroner called. They'd completed a secondary toxicology analysis on Daniel's blood. "We found traces of ethylene glycol," the coroner said. Rebecca had no idea what that was. It's the active ingredient in antifreeze. The dosage found in Daniel's system was enough to cause a slow, painful shutdown of internal organs. Undetectable in small amounts, almost tasteless, and often used in murder. The coroner hesitated before continuing. This wasn't an accident. Someone poisoned him. Rebecca dropped the phone. Her mind reeled back to that morning. Daniel had made the coffee. But who had been in the house? Who had access? Who would want him dead? Her heart pounded. Could it have been Charles? Rebecca began digging into Charles's history. It wasn't easy. He was a man who kept to himself, disciplined, calculated, private. But she soon learned things Daniel had never told her. Charles had been married once before, and his wife had died under suspicious circumstances. An overdose, they'd said. No one had investigated too deeply. She'd been on pain medication for an injury. Charles also had a strained relationship with Daniel growing up. Not abusive, but intense. Competitive. Like Charles saw Daniel not as a son, but as a rival. And then came the final blow. Rebecca found an email draft in Charles's computer while using it for business bookkeeping. It was unsent, but saved in his drafts folder. It was addressed to a friend from out of state. She's starting to come around. Once the mourning phase ends, she'll see what I'm offering. Stability, family, love. She's mine now, just like I planned. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't grief. This was obsession. A plan. Premeditated. Rebecca didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she took the kids and left the house. Stayed with a friend. Called a lawyer. And then, finally, the police. She handed over everything. The email draft, her account of Charles's behavior, and the coroner's toxicology report. But the police told her they needed more. The evidence was circumstantial. The email draft could be explained away. There were no fingerprints on the coffee mug. No surveillance. No confession. Rebecca was horrified. What more do they need? A few days later, she got her answer. Charles showed up at her friend's house unannounced. He looked disheveled, angry. "Why are you hiding?" he demanded. She told him to leave, that she'd spoken to the police, that she knew what he did. He laughed. "You think they'll believe you? I've been a father to you, a grandfather to those kids. You're unstable, grieving. You're not thinking clearly." Then he said something she'd never forget. "Daniel was never strong enough for you. I did what had to be done." Her stomach turned. "What did you just say?" she whispered. But he was already walking away. That night, she broke into Daniel's old office, where Charles had been storing family records and legal documents. In a locked drawer, she found a torn and partially burned will. It was Daniel's, and it left everything to Rebecca and the children, not a cent to Charles. Rebecca turned the charred paper over in her trembling hands. Beneath the soot, Daniel's signature was still visible. So was the date. And that date, it was 3 weeks before he died. As she stared at it, a terrifying realization sank in. Charles had known, and Daniel had tried to protect them. But it was too late. Or was it? Because now, Rebecca had a motive, a confession, a body, and a paper trail. And she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. A grieving widow, a sudden death, and a father-in-law whose affection took a dark and disturbing turn. When Rebecca discovered Daniel's hidden will and a twisted message from his father, the truth began to surface. But the poison ran deeper than she ever imagined, and someone was still watching. Detective Laura Grayson had been working homicide for 15 years. She'd seen everything. Love turned sour, greed in disguise, and families torn apart by secrets. But this case unsettled her. She returned to Rebecca's home with a notepad and a cautious expression. "You did the right thing coming to us," she said. Rebecca handed her the partially burned will and retold the confrontation with Charles. Detective Grayson took notes silently, her expression unreadable. She didn't promise anything, but her eyes lingered a second longer on the will. "A man who destroys a legal document isn't just hiding something," she said. "He's rewriting the future." The investigation was reopened, quietly, but the police couldn't afford to tip Charles off. He was too controlled, too methodical. One wrong move, and he'd vanish before they had anything solid. What Rebecca didn't know was that someone else had already begun watching Charles more closely than the police ever could. 3 days later, a plain white envelope appeared on Rebecca's porch. No stamp, no address, just her name in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of line paper. "He's done this before, in a different state. I was her friend. She was afraid. I couldn't save her. You can't trust him. Protect the kids. Tell the police he kept files. Check the garage. M." Rebecca froze. Who was M? She immediately handed the letter over to Detective Grayson. The writing wasn't a match to Charles, but the content was disturbing and oddly specific. "What do they mean, Viles?" Rebecca asked. Grayson's brow furrowed. "Let's find out." Armed with a warrant, police searched Charles's property. The garage looked like any other. Toolboxes, power drills, organized chaos. But then they noticed something strange. A false panel behind the shelves. Old drywall hastily patched over. When they broke through, they found a small storage area with a lockbox. Inside were 4 small vials, carefully labeled with chemical formulas. Detectives immediately sent them to forensics. Preliminary tests showed that one of the vials contained ethylene glycol, the same toxin that had killed Daniel. Now, they had physical evidence, and motive, and opportunity, but still, no direct proof he administered it. Detective Grayson began digging through old records, particularly for Nevada, where Charles had lived for 2 years before moving to Westbridge. And there it was, a woman named Melissa Carter, 41 years old. Cause of death, complications from undiagnosed lupus. Sudden organ failure. No autopsy, no toxicology. She had been briefly engaged to Charles Whitmore. Grayson tracked down her sister, who remembered Melissa confiding in her. She said he was intense, controlling. He proposed 3 months after meeting her. She wanted out, but she said he was always watching her. And then she died in her sleep, quietly, alone. Melissa's case had been closed for 6 years. Until now, Rebecca struggled to process it all. How many women had Charles pursued after death? How many had said no? And what had happened to those who resisted? But more than fear, she felt guilt. She had let him into her home, let him tuck her kids into bed, let him cook meals in her kitchen after her husband was gone. Meals Daniel would never eat. What if the children had been next? Her thoughts spiraled. She started locking every door, checking under beds, sleeping with her phone beside her pillow. And then, one night, her daughter Emma asked a chilling question. Why doesn't Grandpa love Daddy anymore? The police knew Charles would never confess willingly, so they staged a setup. Rebecca invited Charles to a public park under the guise of talking things out. She wore a hidden wire. Officers waited nearby in plain clothes. As they sat on the bench, Charles seemed calm. Too calm. You made things harder than they needed to be, he said quietly. We could have been happy. Rebecca stayed silent. You think I'm the villain here? I saved you. From a man who never appreciated you. You killed your own son, she said, her voice trembling. He leaned in, close enough to whisper. He wasn't strong enough to protect you. I was. I am. His voice cracked just slightly. But now, you've ruined everything. That was enough. Charles was arrested minutes later, still sitting on the park bench, as if he didn't believe it was real. Charged with first-degree murder, attempted fraud for destroying the will, possession of illegal toxins, suspected involvement in a cold case homicide, Melissa Carter. He said nothing. No cries of innocence. No lawyer demands. Just silence. But the investigation was far from over. In custody, Charles was evaluated by a forensic psychologist. His diagnosis: narcissistic personality disorder with obsessive-compulsive traits. But it wasn't just narcissism. It was entitlement laced with delusion. He believed he was owed love, that if he provided structure and order, affection should follow. And if it didn't, that was the world's mistake, not his. He saw his son as a competitor, his daughter-in-law as the prize, and the children merely pieces in a family legacy he thought he was building, not destroying. News of Charles's arrest shook Westbridge. People who had admired him, who shook his hand at fundraisers and thanked him for his military service, were stunned. But the evidence was overwhelming. And then came the press coverage. The media dubbed it the father-in-law killer. Old photos of Charles holding baby Emma were plastered on the news beside headlines like, "A father's fatal fixation, poison, power, and the widow who survived." Was it all for love or control? Rebecca refused all interviews. She was done giving him airtime. But then, just 2 weeks before trial, a new development came crashing through the fragile peace Rebecca had built. Her lawyer received a call. The forensics lab had found traces of ethylene glycol in a second item recovered from the house. It wasn't in Daniel's mug this time. It was in Rebecca's tea canister. It had been sealed for months, hidden in the back of her pantry, untouched. And suddenly, the case took on an even darker shade. He hadn't just killed Daniel. He may have planned to kill her too. He killed his own son with antifreeze, then tried to erase the evidence. When the widow uncovered his obsession and police found poison in her pantry, it was clear Charles Whitmore wasn't finished. But as the trial approached, one final secret would reveal the full horror of what he had planned all along. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. Rebecca sat near the front, surrounded by victim advocates, flanked by family who'd flown in from out of state. Charles entered in shackles, thinner than before. Pale, calm. His expression was unreadable, except for one moment when he caught Rebecca's eye and smiled. The prosecution opened strong. They laid out the evidence. Ethylene glycol found in Daniel's system, matching chemical vials in Charles's garage, the destroyed will, and the suspicious creation of a new one benefiting only Charles. The disturbing audio recording from the park bench. But the biggest shock came when the lab technician testified. The poison in Daniel's system was identical in chemical structure to the compound found in the canister in Rebecca Whitmore's pantry. In your expert opinion, the prosecutor asked, was this meant for her? Yes, the technician replied. No question. The jury murmured. Rebecca's hands trembled. It hadn't been grief that brought Charles into her home. It had been unfinished business. On the third day of trial, Rebecca's lawyer received a letter. It had been mailed from the detention center 2 weeks earlier, but delayed by prison screening. The letter was written in Charles's handwriting. Inside were 2 pages, stained with what looked like water or sweat. The contents were terrifying. I was trying to fix what was broken. Daniel didn't deserve you. You never saw what I saw in you. You needed structure, someone who knew how to take care of a family. I was building something for us. They would have been better off without him. They would have been better off with me. And then, near the end, she was like you too, Melissa. She wanted to leave, but she was confused. I gave her peace. It was as close to a confession as the DA would ever get from Melissa Carter. It was also evidence of intent, pattern, and motive. But Charles never thought the letter would become public, because he never intended to send it. On day 6 of the trial, the prosecution called their final witness, a man named Ethan Maddox. He stepped onto the stand, visibly nervous. I worked with Charles at the auto shop in Nevada. He was intense, kept himself. One night, he asked me if I knew where to buy clean chemicals, stuff that wouldn't get flagged. Ethan had assumed it was for pest control, but then Charles brought up antifreeze. Specifically, how to make it taste sweet, but lethal. He laughed about it. Ethan said, no one ever sees it coming. This witness tied everything together. The poison wasn't spontaneous. It was premeditated, studied, rehearsed. Charles's defense attorney tried every angle, challenged the chain of custody on the vials, claimed Daniel had a history of alcohol abuse. He didn't. Suggested Rebecca had poisoned the well of public opinion. But the jury wasn't buying it, especially not when they saw the pictures of the children. Happy, safe, beloved by their father, and now fatherless. The prosecution's closing argument echoed in everyone's mind. This man killed his son, tried to poison his daughter-in-law, and wrote a second will that gave him control over a family that never wanted him. This wasn't love. It was obsession, and when he couldn't have them, he decided no one else should. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Charles stood with his hands clasped in front of him. Guilty, on all counts. First-degree murder, attempted murder, fraud, possession of a controlled substance. Rebecca wept, not in joy, in exhaustion. It was over, or so she thought. During sentencing, Charles was given life in prison without parole. He chose to speak before the judge finalized the decision. Everything I did was to protect them, he said. The world is chaotic. I brought order. That's not murder. That's sacrifice. He showed no remorse, no empathy, only self-pity. The judge's response was swift. You poisoned your own son. You terrorized a family. You cloaked violence in the language of love. This court sees through you. And with that, Charles Whitmore was taken away forever. Weeks passed. Rebecca slowly rebuilt a sense of normalcy. She painted the kitchen, enrolled the kids in a new school. Life resumed, quiet, cautious, but peaceful. The community rallied behind her. A memorial was established for Daniel at the local park. Neighbors donated books, toys, food. Strangers sent cards. But at night, Rebecca still checked the locks, still double-checked the baby monitor. Healing was not linear, and grief never left completely. But they were safe now. That's all that mattered. Until one morning, Rebecca received a voicemail from an unfamiliar number. A woman's voice. Hi, I'm sorry to call out of the blue. My name is Elena Marks. I saw the trial on the news. I used to know Charles Whitmore. In Texas. In 2006. I think something similar happened to my sister. Her name was Lily. She died suddenly. No one ever looked into it. But after watching your story, I think she might have been his first. The line went dead. Rebecca stood frozen. Was there another victim? Had Charles done this before Melissa? How many lives had he quietly erased? Long before Daniel, Charles Whitmore is behind bars. His crimes exposed. His son dead. His obsession revealed. But when a stranger from Texas makes contact, a new chapter emerges. A whisper from the past. A death that was never questioned. And a victim who may have been the very first in a long, quiet line of destruction. The voicemail from Elena Marks was only 17 seconds long, but it shattered Rebecca's fragile peace. Her name was Lily. She died suddenly. No one ever looked into it. The name didn't appear in any court records from Charles's trial. No one had mentioned a Lily. But if this was true, if Charles had killed before Melissa, then his history of violence began even earlier than anyone knew. Rebecca forwarded the message to Detective Grayson, who immediately opened a background trace. It didn't take long. Lily Marks died in Lubbock, Texas, 2006. Age 33. Listed cause: acute respiratory failure from undiagnosed illness. No autopsy performed. Cremated within 48 hours. Relationship at time of death: engaged to Charles Whitmore. Detective Grayson and a Texas investigator traveled to meet Elena Marks, who still lived in Lubbock. She greeted them with a binder. Inside, photos of Lily, emails, text messages, and one handwritten journal. She was healthy, Elena said. Ran 5 miles a day. She didn't smoke, didn't drink. But 6 weeks after she got engaged to Charles, she started getting sick. First headaches, then nausea, then seizures. Doctors were baffled. Tests were inconclusive. She was in and out of hospitals. Then, one night, she simply stopped breathing. Charles arranged the cremation. Alone, without consulting Lily's family. We didn't even get to say goodbye, Elena whispered. He said she wanted to be cremated, but she'd never said that. We begged him to wait. He said no. The timeline of Lily's death mirrored Melissa Carter's. Both met Charles through community events. Both were engaged within a few months. Both began to suffer sudden, mysterious health issues. Both were cremated before an autopsy. Both were isolated from family in their final days. Even more chilling, Elena found a receipt from a local chemical supplier in Lily's old paperwork. It was made out to C. Whitmore. The product? Ethylene glycol. But without a body, there could be no conclusive proof. Only a pattern. A terrifying, deliberate pattern. Rebecca sat at her kitchen table, staring at photos of Lily, Melissa, and herself. 3 different women. 3 different states. One thing in common. Charles. She realized something devastating. She had never been special to him. Charles hadn't been drawn to her because of who she was. He had been drawn to her because she fit a type. Empathetic, trusting, recently heartbroken, easy to isolate. His behavior wasn't an anomaly. It was ritual. She wasn't his obsession. She was his next project. The Lubbock District Attorney submitted a formal petition to exhume Melissa Carter's remains. Luckily, her body had not been cremated. Toxicology was conducted under a court order, and what they found confirmed everyone's worst fear. Trace levels of ethylene glycol were still present in her bone marrow. Not enough to kill, not on its own, but enough to indicate prolonged exposure. She had been poisoned slowly, a timeline matching her months-long decline. Melissa's death was officially reclassified as homicide. The charge was added to Charles's record, but he refused to leave his cell for arraignment. Instead, he sent a message to the prosecutor. Let the dead stay dead. Digging them up won't bring them back. Rebecca wasn't sure why she requested a prison visit. Closure? Curiosity? Justice? Charles agreed to the meeting, his first since sentencing. When she walked in the visitation room, he was already seated behind the glass. She picked up the phone. So did he. You've aged, he said, smiling faintly. Rebecca didn't flinch. They found Melissa's body. Poisoned. They're building a new case. He looked amused. Melissa was weak. Like Lily, they wanted something they couldn't carry. You were different. You knew how to hold a family together. You just didn't know how to protect it. She leaned in. You never loved any of us. You only wanted to control us. Control is love, he replied. Love without control is chaos. She stared at him, trying to find the man she once let into her home. There was nothing left but delusion. Rebecca stood up to leave. They're gonna make sure you die in there. Alone. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Then you'd better hurry. Back home, Rebecca decided to go through one last box of Daniel's things. Items she'd packed away after his death and never touched again. In the bottom of the box was a small desk organizer from his office. She opened one of the drawers and froze. Inside was a sealed envelope with her name on it. Her hands shook as she opened it. Asterisk, Becca, if you're reading this, something's happened, and I don't want you to panic. I've been feeling sick, and I don't trust that it's just the flu. I think it might be something else. Something Charles related. I know he's been acting strange. Watching me, asking about my tea habits. Just promise me. Don't let him near the kids if anything happens. And don't trust what he tells you about me. I love you. I always will. Daniel, asterisk. Rebecca clutched the letter to her chest. He'd known. He had tried to warn her from the other side of death. Months later, as the second case against Charles prepared for trial in Texas, authorities conducted another deep dive into his digital records. What they found chilled even seasoned agents. On a password-protected hard drive, Charles had created folders labeled with names. Lily, Melissa, Rebecca. Inside were photos, notes, schedules, medical records he'd stolen, journals. But there was one more folder. Emma. Inside, dozens of documents, school photos, doctor appointments, growth charts, even notes about when to transition guardianship. Rebecca was notified immediately. Charles hadn't just planned to eliminate Daniel and take her. He had planned to outlive her and take the children. Just days before the Texas trial was set to begin, Charles was moved to a higher security facility. That night, he was found unconscious in his cell. A suspected overdose. Pills smuggled in. He was revived, but barely. And before authorities could begin questioning him about the folder labeled Emma, he slipped into a coma. Now, his victims and his secrets wait in limbo. One question remains. Was Charles Whitmore working alone? Because buried in his hidden folder was one final, unnamed file. A series of email exchanges from someone identified only as M. Whitmore 92. Charles Whitmore, a father who poisoned his own son to steal his family, now lies in a coma, awaiting trial for his second murder. But buried deep in his digital files was a single clue that threatened to unravel everything. An email thread signed by someone named M. Whitmore 92. The question remains, did Charles act alone? Or did his twisted legacy infect the next generation? The folder labeled Emma had been horrifying enough, but it was the M. Whitmore 92 account that reopened a door no one thought needed checking. Investigators traced the email address to a VPN routed through 4 international servers. Military-grade obfuscation. It wasn't just someone hiding. It was someone who knew how to disappear. FBI analysts managed to extract metadata that led to a breakthrough. The device used to access the account had once been registered to Margot Whitmore, Charles's estranged daughter from his first marriage. Rebecca had heard the name before, but only once. Charles had mentioned a daughter who hated him. That's all he said. According to public records, Margot Whitmore was born in 1992, left home at 16, and legally changed her name by age 21. No forwarding address, no online footprint, no social media, but the IP trail didn't lie. She was alive, and she'd been in contact with Charles right before Daniel's death. A warrant was issued. Through a financial services partner, authorities found a recent address in Flagstaff, Arizona. Margot was taken in for questioning. At first, she denied everything, but when shown the emails, her expression changed. She didn't ask how they got them. She asked, does Rebecca know who her husband really was? The room froze. Detectives leaned in. What did she mean? Margot told investigators that her father had been manipulating families long before Lily, Melissa, or Rebecca. He liked women who already had kids. He liked stepping in as the savior. But once he had them, they didn't last. When asked why she communicated with him again after years of estrangement, Margot confessed she'd been promised an inheritance, a trust fund she believed Daniel had no right to. In one email, Charles wrote, Daniel was always the golden boy, but when he's gone, it will all be yours again. Margot never admitted to helping poison Daniel, but she did send her father detailed personal information about Rebecca, the kids, even Daniel's work schedule. I didn't know what he'd do with it. I just wanted what was mine." She was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, but due to lack of direct evidence, she took a plea deal, 5 years probation and mandatory psychological counseling. She walked free, but the stain of what she helped start would follow her forever. Charles Whitmore never woke up. The coma lasted 3 weeks before his body finally shut down. Heart failure, officially listed as natural causes, but some say it was poetic. He left no will, no estate, no letters, only a trail of trauma. A hollow man who tried to play God by destroying the lives of those who loved him most. Rebecca moved to a quiet neighborhood in Oregon with her 2 children. She changed their last names. She started therapy, and she began speaking to victims' advocacy groups about coercive control, emotional grooming, and familial betrayal, topics that still remain dangerously misunderstood. In one interview, she said, "I used to believe monsters had fangs and claws, but sometimes they hold your hand. Sometimes they tuck your kids into bed, and sometimes they wear a smile so convincing that you forget to be afraid." On what would have been Daniel's 40th birthday, Rebecca opened a foundation in his name, the Daniel Carter Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting families affected by domestic betrayal and psychological abuse. The first scholarship was awarded to a young woman studying forensic psychology. Her essay title, "The Evil That Knocks First, is Family." There's a reason this story must be told, not for the shock, but for the pattern. Because evil doesn't always arrive in chaos. Sometimes it comes carefully, lovingly. It wears trust like a disguise. Charles Whitmore didn't just poison his son. He poisoned a legacy. He poisoned the idea that love is always safe. But in the end, truth caught up. And from that truth, healing began. So if there's one lesson we take away from this, let be this. Trust your instincts, even when they tell you something your heart doesn't want to hear. And remember, family is not defined by blood. It's defined by protection, loyalty, and love that doesn't manipulate. Asterisk, if this story moved you, taught you something new, or gave you chills, do us a favor. Click the like button to support more powerful storytelling. Share this video with someone who might need to hear this message. Drop a comment below. What shocked you the most about Charles Whitmore's case? And don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories that don't just inform, they leave a mark. Because behind every headline, there's a human story.